immigrant. So in this professor community banks, professor community banks, community, professor gas Congress, professor Congress, professor Voldor,
banks, community banks,
question,
Congress, community, Congress,
banks, gas question,
community, question, community banks,
professor
Congress,
Banks, question, community Congress,
community,
Congress
question, banks,
community question, community banks,
banks, question,
Professor, community banks, community, professor,
question, gas, banks,
Congress,
banks,
Professor
question, community bank,
Gas.
gas, contest,
Congress, gas question.
Banks,
community,
banks, question,
Professor, community banks,
question, community, Congress, community banks,
question,
Congress,
community banks,
question, community banks,
banks, community banks, banks,
question, gas, professor question, senator question,
Professor banks, community banks, community banks, professor banks, professor banks, professor banks,
question,
Congress,
Gas
question,
gas question. I want to ask you a question. Banks,
banks, question, banks, Congress,
question, customer,
question, Congress, banks,
community banks,
community banks,
Professor Gas question. Banks,
community banks, Congress,
banks,
professor, communist banks, professor
55 regulation correct. Banks would use
my
talking about the term community banks, Congress,
banks, community question, community banks,
professor community banks question,
professor Congress, banks,